Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. In this episode, we talked to Richard Allen about BDD. Rich has been developing software since graduating Bournemouth University in 1999. He's a co-founder of LeaveWizard.com, an online leave and absence management system. He's also the co-founder of Developer South Coast, a technical user group based in Southampton, England, who meet on the third Thursday of each month. They discuss a wide range of subjects in software development. Rich is an independent software development consultant helping businesses to implement agile and lean development technologies. So welcome to The Cynical Developer, Rich.
Hey, good to be here, thanks.
Yeah, it's good to have you on, and we've had somebody on to talk about TDD, and now we're going to go for another acronym of BDD. So we'll jump straight in with the questions. And BDD, let's clear this up straight away, is that I've heard it referred to as business-driven development and behaviour-driven development. Are these the same thing? Is it just a different imagining of the acronym, or are they two different things?
Okay, so to start off then, so the term I typically use for BDD is behaviour-driven development. My understanding is that business-driven development is more about kind of developing business process models and kind of coming up with key performance indicators and terms to help businesses explain to an IT department. But behaviour-driven development is kind of more about using conversations and examples to capture requirements in small deliverable stories. So I think they're subtly different, but their goal is probably the same, just a different way of achieving the same thing.
Sure. So what we're going to be discussing today then is behaviour-driven development.
That's right, yeah.
Sure. So you touched on a little bit there on what BDD is. So are you able to go in a little bit more depth about what BDD is?
Yeah, cool. So BDD is basically a concept that was developed by someone called Dan North. And while he was at ThoughtWorks, he was coaching people on how to implement agile and XP practices, such as test-driven development. But what he found was that while he was coaching it, he kind of came up with these the same questions from different developers, and they were struggling to understand what they needed to test, what they shouldn't be testing, how much to test, things like that.
Sure.
And basically the term test, he found, seemed to get in the way. People seemed to think it implied that in order to test something, it needed to exist first. So in the developer's mind, it was kind of tricky for them to understand how they would write a test for something that didn't exist yet. But when he started to refer to test as defining behavior, such as what should the class do, it became a bit more clearer to the developer how you could begin to write a specification for the behavior rather than a test. And then this over time kind of developed into behavior-driven development as we know it today. And it's now kind of how we try to capture the behavior of a feature through capturing real-world examples. And we try to kind of focus on what the feature should do rather than how the feature is implemented. And typically, BDD will use the idea of user stories or features in the form of have you come across user stories before? I assume you have.
Yeah, sure. They implement, is it Gherkin language with the when this, then that?
Yeah, so typically the user story would be in the form of, say, in order to achieve some goal as a type of user, I want to get something done. And that would be your user story, and you would then extend that with a bunch of scenarios, and those scenarios would be in the form of the given, when, then. And if you've coming from a test-driven development background, it's kind of synonymous with the concept of arrange, act, and assert. So your given would be the arrange step, your when would be the act step, and your assert would be the then step.
So we touched on there test-driven development. It's another acronym very similar, which is TDD. This can be used alongside BDD. It's not a case of it's use one or the other. They actually work together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're kind of both complementary, and you can use them at different levels in your software development. So what I tend to find is that using BDD, it's much easier to write a failing test first. So in TDD you have the principle of red-green refactor.
Yeah, sure.
You've spoken about those. So
yes.
So you write a failing test, write code to make the test go green, and then you would refactor the code afterwards. But some developers kind of struggle with how to write the failing test first. So they end up actually doing tests after development, because you typically write the tests around the class level. So for example, you might write tests around a controller or a repository. But what I find tends to happen is you end up writing a lot of test code around specific class implementations.
Yeah.
And you end up writing lots of different implementations of the mocks. So you might capture different behaviors, but around, the same behavior mocked in different test classes. And then over time, it actually can become quite restrictive and almost a barrier to refactoring, because you've spent so much time writing the tests that actually you end up almost not wanting to change a service to a factory or a service to a repository, because it would just break hundreds of tests that you've spent a load of time writing.
Yeah.
And what BDD does is gives you kind of a layer above the TDD or the lower level class tests that describe the overall behavior. And by capturing it in business kind of language, you abstract away from the code, and it gives you a way that you can talk to the business about what the test is doing without introducing them to kind of the syntax of C# or anything like that. And by using the given when then format, you can then start to look to automate those tests as well.
Right. So would you still do, as you do with normal TDD, your class tests, or do you just follow the happy path of the behavior requirement?
So where you've got, so typically I would start off with the behavior requirement as far as it can go, but where you get to a point where you've got some logic that might be specifically tricky or hard to test in a behavior-driven scenario, you would then go into test-driven and actually do the class level testing. So it's the TDD side of it then becomes a bit more specific around more complex areas of the system.
Sure, and it's easier to relate that back to the ticket and the story and that you're working on, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. With the feature level of stuff with BDD, because it's all in plain English, it's easier to find features and what they're relating to and the user story that they've been driven from. Whereas if you've got a test written in C#, the only people that are going to kind of delve into that are going to be the developers.
Sure. Now, is there a relation with domain-driven development as well? So DDD.
Yes, kind of. I suppose the biggest common relationship there is that it extends the DDD perspective of something called a ubiquitous language. And that is essentially just it's a common language that can be used by all aspects of a business, such as the developers and testers and business analysts, to agree on the terms that represent the business domain items. So really, it's an extension on top of the DDD concepts.
Okay, great. So as well as benefits for developers having a clearer idea of what's going on and what they need to actually develop against, what are the key benefits for the QA or your test teams?
Sure. So probably the biggest benefit I see for testers is that they're involved in the development process far earlier than they probably would be previously. So because you're defining the behavior of your system up front, and you're trying to capture what it is you're developing in this business language, they can start to contribute to the discussion about what scenarios might be included in the feature. So, and it's typically done using a meeting called the Three Amigos. Have you heard of that term before?
I have, but explain it to the listeners.
Sure. So Three Amigos is basically where you get three people in a room. It could be more, but typically there would be one representative from the business, so a business analyst, a developer, and a tester, and they all attend a meeting to discuss the feature or various features at a time, and then try to kind of extract the scenarios that are relevant to the feature that's under development. But each attendee kind of brings a different perspective to the table. So your business guy is normally thinking about the value, what value is it's going to add. The developers kind of thinking about the implementation and how that's going to affect the architecture or something like that. And the testers, they're kind of constantly throwing in there, how do I test this, or what happens in this scenario, and what about these things we've already developed, is it going to break that, or what's the impact going to be? So by bringing those three people together, the Three Amigos, you get a more rounded discussion about what the feature should end up being.
Sure.
And really for testers, I tend to find that it helps development teams in general become kind of more cross-functional. So it helps them to kind of reinforce the concepts that your testers can and should be considered a core part of your development team, rather than just throw things over the wall to them. Get them involved early and get them working with those features. And then on top of that, you can get consistency between, say, if you start to write automation tests off of the BDD specifications, normally like a manual tester might actually start to become an automated tester, and they might use tools like Selenium to do UI testing. But you can also write kind of unit level tests in the same format. So because it's more consistent between the environments, a tester might start to be a bit more brave and kind of venture into the world of the development and feel more comfortable that he understands what's going on. And slowly over time, you can introduce them to development techniques that developers know off by heart, but testers is kind of new to them. So your development team can really help to support the testers to become better programmers, and the testers can help your developers to become better testers.
Yeah, it sort of opens up the developers' eyes really a little bit, I think, to looking at the bigger picture and not being sort of blinkered in their little worlds of this is the route that we're going with the code and this is the happy path and we'll stick to this. I think that helps a little bit. I know in my previous team we started to integrate the testers with the developers, so we had a single QA or tester sat with one or two developers, so they could work on user stories and progress together. So as soon as something was finished, the tester could test it, and get back to the developer straight away, rather than, as you say, throwing it over the wall and hoping for the best and the developer moving on to something else, and that story then sitting and waiting for however long before the developer comes back to it.
Yeah, exactly.
And unfortunately, Three Amigos, I was hoping there was going to be something to do with Steve Martin and Chevy Chase in there, but and who's the other guy? Nedlanders, I think, something like that. That was a
film.
Yeah, it is, and I think showing my age a little bit there. Some of the younger listeners might have to go and Google that one.
Well worth it. It would be well worth it.
Oh, definitely is. I'm not a massive fan of Chevy Chase, but he did me proud in there. I like that film.
Very much so.
I've spoken to a few people over time about BDD, and a lot of them say that it's not focused on testing. Now, we've spoken about testing quite a bit already. Is it focused on testing? Is it not focused on testing? Can you give any opinion on that?
So I think it first and foremost, BDD's more about capturing business requirements through having the right conversation. So it focuses on kind of getting the words right, and that initial focus should be on sort of understanding the requirements through the use of real-world examples. But to say that it's not focused on testing, I think is not necessarily true. It's very much about being able to capture those business requirements in a way that can be easily tested. But it's almost like a two-stage thing. So the first principle is get the conversation right, make sure you're building the right thing. But if you get that and you get your given when then format right, it can be turned into automation tests, and ultimately build a better, more stable, maintainable test suite. So maybe first and foremost, it's not focused on testing. It's about behavior, but it's very complementary to the TDD approach, and because it makes it easy to write failing tests first, I'd say it's almost better than TDD in a way. That might be inflammatory to some people.
Yeah, that's controversial, I think. You mentioned XP earlier, which for those that aren't au fait with that term, it's extreme programming. If we're doing BDD, that lends itself, as we've already said, to Scrum, Kanban, and other agile methodologies as well? Or does it have its own sort of ethos around it, or does it just marry up very nicely with them?
Yeah, pretty much. BDD doesn't kind of dictate how and when it should be applied. So as far as your processes for whether you're a Scrum team, a Kanban team, whatever you're doing there, the main commonality between each of those, I suppose, would be the use of user stories as the deliverable chunks of data, but how you deliver those features and what process you follow, whether it's continuous delivery or 2-week sprints, 4-week sprints, that's kind of up to you. It's not dictated by BDD in any way.
Sure. So if I was working with Scrum or Kanban in my current place, and we weren't following BDD, or we didn't believe we were following BDD, what's a process to get started with a project in BDD? Can you take an existing project and move it to this, or is it best to start with a clean project?
I'd say there's probably there's nothing stopping you kind of taking the next feature that's coming up and start to take on some of the practices of BDD, so capturing the stories in the given when then format. So you can kind of start to introduce BDD on existing projects. If you were going to kick off a project from scratch, be a case of getting all the stakeholders in a room with developers and testers, and do a typical kind of all the user stories, maybe do some user story mapping to work out what the highest priority stories to get delivered. And then once you defined that initial backlog, you would just chunk on through that backlog and define the scenarios for each feature as you come across them.
Sure. So all these features and all these requirements, they're still coming from the product owners.
Yes.
They're not being controlled by somebody additional or anything like that.
No, absolutely. It's coming from the product owners and the business analysts. But obviously, with the Three Amigos format, you're trying to contribute both the developer and tester side of things, so that you eke out of the business what it is they actually need. You tend to find, obviously, the business comes to the table with a solution rather than a problem.
Yeah.
And so it's up to the devs and the testers to kind of eke that back out of them and actually get to the root cause of what they're actually the problem they're trying to solve. And that can be helped by asking them to provide you real examples. So, can you give me an example of when that happens in the business, or give me some real numbers if well, I suppose as an example. So if you were to say, given my bank account is in credit and I've made no withdrawals recently, when I attempt to withdraw an amount less than my card's limit, then the withdrawal should complete without any errors or warnings. And
Sure.
then there might be a whole bunch of other scenarios about, well, what happens when you don't have enough credit, and all things like that. So you're just kind of probing the business in those meetings to eke out all the scenarios that they can think of.
Yeah, I think it's there's probably a training exercise there for the developers, for the people running the Three Amigos, but also getting the business to actually understand how to break down a problem, I guess, because it's I suppose it's good that they can sit there and say, well, this is what's going wrong, but this is what we want it to do. But actually getting them to explain the different scenarios would be is probably quite hard.
Yeah, and it's actually probably one of the mistakes maybe that people can make with it. They just assume that the business should automatically be able to come up with these beautifully written scenarios in given when then format that they'll never change or tweak or modify. And it's very much a case of the three parts working together to understand what those scenarios should look like. So don't expect your BAs to come up with amazing stories or scenarios. Try to help them to come to the table with a problem, which you can then mold into some scenarios that capture what it is they're really looking to develop.
Yeah, definitely. I've implemented Scrum in a few different organisations, and trying to get the buy-in from the business is always joyful. I think it must be my favourite part of the process to get in there, and they kick and scream all the way through until they finally see that there's actually some benefit. And I can see that implementing BDD would be a similar process and have its similar joys. But the fruits of the labour, I think, would be very good, and the end product that you produce is going to be a lot better and actually do what the customer wants.
Yes, exactly. And that's the trick, right? Is to sell to the business that actually, by allowing them to talk about things in their terms, it breaks down some of the barriers between the business and the developers. So it kind of helps to bridge that gap where you've got business terminology and technical implementations. So the business don't become so scared that it's these tests are all written in C# and they've got all this syntax around them that it can become quite scary.
Yeah. Talking to business people about programming code and how the assert works, and if it's true or false, and if there's a count of this, and to make sure that we verify that X, Y, and Z is run, they glaze over the same as we glaze over when they start talking about accounting and
and return on investment
and all the fluffy stuff that they like to bang on about. But yeah, definitely, because it's quite a complex sort of process. There are bound to be some common mistakes that people make when they're trying to implement BDD. Are you able to sort of cover a couple of those, maybe stop our listeners from falling into those pitfalls?
Sure, yeah. So I'd say probably the number one thing is that it's not about automation and the tools. So kind of a lot of people see, you can automate things using Selenium and UI testing, and they kind of see these tools implemented using Cucumber or something like SpecFlow. But they once they jump onto that, so I've seen some developers. Have you heard of the ice cream? Sorry, have you heard of the automation triangle?
No.
So the automation triangle, there's a few different versions of it, but it's a triangle, and at the base you'd have unit tests, which signifies you should typically have more unit tests than maybe the next level up, which would be integration tests, and then the next level on top of that would be UI tests, and right at the very top would be your manual testing.
Sure.
So the implication is you want much more unit tests than you do have manual tests. But when people first kick off with BDD, they get all excited, start testing the UI, and then go, actually, our testers are now covering all of our code with these UI tests, so I don't need to write as many unit tests. And you end up with the kind of the flip side of the automation triangle. You get kind of the automation ice cream cone. So right at the bottom, the unit tests are really small,
right,
but at the top, the UI tests are really there's a lot more UI tests than there are unit tests.
Sure.
And then you end up there with kind of unmaintainable UI tests. They're much more expensive to maintain going forward, and it's just all wrong. So really, you want to be focusing on the initial reason why you want to take it on is to get a better understanding of the actual requirements and get your given when then right. So understand how that works, what the given is, what the when is, and what the then is, so that when you're ready, you can move into starting to automate it. Don't rush in with, we're suddenly going to automate these tests and everything's going to be great. The second thing is probably typically they find the business doesn't want to write specifications. So there's always a discussion about who should write the specs. And normally it's the business, as I mentioned earlier, the business are expected to kind of just come to the table with these perfectly formed requirements, but you need to really focus on that collaborative approach to understanding what the features should be, and really focus on the business bringing their problem to the table.
I think a lot of these processes call for time boxing of meetings as well. So we've allocated half an hour, 2 hours to this. I think when you first start getting into this sort of thing, it could be at least a good idea for the first few times to do this is to time box that meeting a little bit longer than you would perceive, just to give that explanation time and things. I would say. Yeah,
definitely, and also don't treat BDD like another UI scripting tool. So you've got to retrain your brain to think about the behavior, what the system should do, regardless of the implementation. So a lot of mistakes I find is people will start writing the given when thens as though they're clicking a UI. So when I click the upload button, and when I click this and click that, and what you end up doing there is just recreating a test script inside of BDD. But actually you want it to be much more about what is the intention of the code rather than how it's implementing it, and get that decoupled, because that frees you then to use that feature or that scenario for a unit test or for a UI test. It doesn't matter what the interface level is.
Yeah,
it
sure.
could be a UI test, or it could be going in through the API controller, or it could be an MVC controller. It doesn't matter if you've captured what the intended behavior should be. So yeah, don't focus on how it does it. Focus on why and what it needs to do.
Yeah, so I guess an example of that would be, rather than when I'm a user and I'm logged in and I'm on the upload page, that I click the upload button, it shows me a prompt where I can select a picture and I can upload that photograph to my system, and then I want that system to pick out the photos, the people in the photo. It would be, as a user, I want to be able to upload a picture and for it to automatically pick out the people in that photograph.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yep.
So we've given sort of the 10,000-foot overview of BDD. Do you know of any courses or good tutorials or blogs or anything that you'd want to share with the listeners, and say that if you want to go and actually learn more about it, that these are the places to go?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, 100% would go with a book called Specification by Example by Gojko Adsik, which we'll put a link in probably at the end of this. But have you read it at all?
I haven't, no.
Okay. It's a really great book for describing how to capture examples from the business. But what I really liked about it was that he went through lots of different teams, all of different structures. So some maybe had more developers than they had BAs, or some had a lot more BAs, some had some more testers.
Yeah.
And kind of describes in the book how they each use BDD, or specification by example. So BDD can be kind of almost intertwined with something called acceptance test driven development. And what he did in his book is called it specification by example, because that's the core principles of each of those, is to grab real world examples of what you're trying to do. So absolutely go and read that book. And then other resources would be kind of look at anything by Dan North, who's obviously the founder or the father of BDD, and someone called Liz Keogh, who writes some really good blog articles on how to apply BDD and when it's a good time to use it and when it's not.
Okay, fantastic. We shall get some links into to the books and the blogs that we just mentioned then. But we're just about out of time.
Cool.
So thanks for coming on. Thanks for giving us an overview of BDD. And I hope this has been enlightening for the listeners as well. I've learned a few things. It's not after talking about it, it's something I have actually done, but not realised I was doing it.
Cool. That's good to know.
Yeah. Great stuff. So thanks for listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm Jay Stoddart, and you've been listening to Richard Allen talking about BDD. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform and help the Cynical Developer to grow by increasing its audience. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website where you can find all the resource links and show notes for each episode.